Hello everybody and welcome to this AQA GCSE Biology Paper 2 exam walkthrough, and today we're going to do fairly similar to what we did for our Paper 1 exam walkthrough, except rather than focusing on the different assessment objectives, we're going to look at each of the topics in a bit more detail with some exam style questions and how you should go about approaching questions on that particular topic. So we'll do what to expect, covering both the triple and combined specifications, and hopefully we fill off some key content tips and strategies and some exam questions for you to try as well. So let's crack on. So in the same way as for Biology Paper 1, your Paper 2 will be fairly similar. So triple biology, 1 hour 45 minutes, 100 marks with it being 50% of your GCSE. And then for your combined students, you will be doing a 1 hour 15-minute paper worth 70 marks, making up 16.7% of your GCSE. And the question types will be the same. So multiple choice, short answer, structured and open response. So you've done one of these exams now and you kind of hopefully should have a good idea of what it feels like to kind of go through those different kind of questions. But just in general, remember this is your last biology paper. So really try and keep that energy up and know that you're just adding to what you've already achieved. So the topics covered, as you probably well know, are B5 Homeostasis, B6 Inheritance, Variation and Evolution, and B7 Ecology. And again, the specification is your best friend, knowing how to use that specification to know what you need to know and how you need to be able to answer questions on a particular topic, whether it be just understanding, being able to describe, evaluating, those kind of keywords in that specification will be a really good guide. And so again, there are some required practicals which are covered within those topics. And for each required practical, you want to make sure that you know the hypothesis, the variables, so the independent, dependent and control variables, the equipment and why you need each key bit of equipment, the method, not word for word, but just making sure you have a general idea of how the method should work, data collection methods, data visualization, and some evaluative points as well, because some stuff like that will come up in every single paper. So these are the required practicals from Paper 2. So there are 4 of them. There are reaction time, plant tropism, decay, and the fieldwork investigations. So for reaction time, that's for everybody. Everybody would have come across this reaction time practical before. Often they'll ask about how you can improve reliability, since it uses a stopwatch to determine the length of time taken to react, and identifying the variables as well. For the fieldwork investigations, they will often be talking about how to use a quadrat, the use of transects, and the sampling methods as well. That's a very common exam question for the fieldwork investigations, and that is one of the favourites of examiners in the past. And then the other 2 are both only for the triple science or the biology paper students. So plant tropisms, often the question will be asking you to observe some results and explain it in terms of the light or gravity response, or potentially the role of auxin as well. And then decay, which is related to the milk decay practical, which you did in class. They'll often be talking about control variables and the importance of pH and temperature in decomposition and decay, and also the role of enzymes as well is often a common one there. As we've said, it's important to cover all 7 of those points for each of these, so that when a practical comes up, it might not be these exact practicals that you've covered, but you can identify which practical it's related to and how to adapt your understanding from the practical that you completed to answering the question that you've been given in the correct context. So key ideas. Just like with Paper 1, there are some key ideas that are used by examiners to inspire them to create exam questions. And this should be something that, these are ideas that should be in the back of your mind for whilst you are doing revision, because it kind of explains how different topics are linked and the key principles that you need to know. So the first one, living organisms may form populations of single species, communities of many species, and ecosystems interacting with each other, with the environment, and with humans in many different ways. So that's linking to B7 with your key definitions for populations, communities, ecosystems, species, and their interaction with the environment and humans as well. Living organisms are interdependent and show adaptations to their environment. The chemicals in ecosystems are continuously cycling through the natural world. So water and carbon cycles are the key ones that you have learnt about there. The characteristics of a living organism are influenced by its genome and the interaction with the environment. So that's talking about genotypes and phenotypes and the difference between those and how they link together to produce the observed characteristics of an organism. Evolution occurs by the process of natural selection and accounts both for diversity and how organisms are all related to varying degrees. So those are the 5 key ideas which are listed in those sections which are most relevant to this paper. And then you've also got the use of conceptual models and theories to make sense of the observed diversity of natural phenomena, the assumption that every effect has one or more cause, that change is driven by differences between different objects and the systems when they interact, that many such interventions occur over a distance without direct contact, that science progresses through a cycle of hypotheses, practical experimentation, observation, theory development and review, and that quantitative analysis is the central element both for many theories and scientific methods of inquiry. So you would have heard these ones before, and these are the same throughout all of your science papers. So I'm sure you're used to them by now, but I just wanted to give you that brief recap. So how are you assessed? You're assessed through AO1, AO2 and AO3. So AO1, just to refresh your memory, is that demonstration of knowledge and understanding. and that is 40% of the questions will be based on, rather 40% of the marks you achieve will be based on AO1. AO2 is that application of knowledge and understanding of scientific ideas, inquiry, techniques and procedures, again is worth 40%. And then AO3 is that ability to analyse information and ideas, and that could also involve discussing, evaluations, those kind of analysis as well. All of that sort of stuff comes under AO3, and that will be 20% of your marks. So again, just going to reiterate the command words just in case you haven't seen paper 1 exam. We go into these in a bit more detail, but usually they can give you a bit of a clue to which assessment objective you are going to be focused on here. And they can, or there can be questions which uses more than one of them, but this gives you a general idea of what the main aim of the question is. So AO1s will be more about those identify, give, state, who, when, where, which, how, those kind of simple command words. AO2 might be calculations, explaining, describing, completing, like a table, for example. And then AO3 will be words like analyze, determine, predict, justify and evaluate, or potentially suggest. And just as I said earlier, that AO1 and AO2 marks can be within an AO3 question, so you've always got to be careful to make sure that you don't just jump to the analyses if you feel like you need to give a bit of context first. And just as I said, that AO1 and AO2 will make up that like 37 to 42% of paper 1 and paper 2 as well. And then AO3 is slightly less, but they can be those crucial extra marks that get you up a grade or two. So for this paper, I think the key concepts and making sure that you've covered every part of the specification that you need to is really important in order to feel confident answering questions about each topic. And it's important, particularly when it's one of the later exams, that you don't forget to cover the content. When everything has been very overwhelming for the last few months, it's quite important to take a step back and take count of what topics are going to come up and what you might need to be able to answer questions on. So let's just go through each of these for each of the 3 units that we have coming up on this paper. So for the key concepts for homeostasis and response, so the homeostasis definition and the components of them, so receptors, coordination centers and effectors. The nervous system, so understanding what the central nervous system is, the role of sensory, motor and relay neurons and synapses as well. The reflex arc and pathway, this is quite a common exam question, and it might be a scenario that you haven't come across before, but it's just making sure to cover those key 5 points that you always see in a reflex arc, and just making sure that you can apply it to any given random context that the examiners might throw at you. For triple students, the brain and the structure. And then if you're a triple and higher tier student, you'll need to make sure you have a memory of the study methods as well. And again, for triple only, the eye. So the structure of the eye, the accommodation, defects and correction. Thermoregulation as well for triple students. So you need to know the processes of vasodilation and vasoconstriction, and then various responses, which also thermoregulate, such as sweating and shivering. That's not an exclusive list, but just some of the key ones. Hormones and endocrine glands, so make sure you know the location of the pituitary, thyroid, pancreas, adrenal glands and the ovaries and testes. And then also the control of blood glucose, so everyone needs to know about the role of insulin and glucagon, and the differences between diabetes 1 and 2, the causes, the effects and treatment methods. And then HD only students as well need to be able to link the role of glucagon to negative feedback as well. And so this is a very long topic, which is why it's important just to quickly overview what's in each topic. So the second part of B5, it starts with, for triple students at least, the maintenance of water and nitrogen balance in the body. So that would be the role of kidneys, urea and selective reabsorption. And then also linked to that would be deamination, which is linked to urea above, and the role of ADH. But those 2 bits there are only for the people doing the higher tier paper. And kidney failure as well, so dialysis and transplant methods for treating kidney failure, and the advantages and disadvantages of both. And again, that whole topic is for triple only students, so if you're combined, don't worry if you haven't seen it before. But everybody will need to know about the reproductive hormones, so FSH, LH, estrogen, progesterone and testosterone. The interactions of some of the hormones above in the menstrual cycle. Contraceptive methods as well, so both hormonal and non-hormonal methods, and the advantages and disadvantages of each, but you need to make sure you can apply that to different scenarios and different people. IVF and different fertility drugs, and that's a higher tier only topic. And feedback systems as well, which is linked to the glucagon negative feedback loop we talked about on the page before. But yeah, that's another higher tier only part of it. So combined higher and triple higher students will need to make sure that they can answer questions about negative feedback systems. And then finally, plant hormones. And that's the extra bit they've added on to the end of B5. So triple students all need to know about the control and coordination of auxins, gibberellins and ephine. And then higher tier paper students will also need to know how they can be used in industry. Let's go through a selection of B5 questions just so you can get an idea of how we are going to apply our knowledge we've just talked about into different types of questions. So the first question here is explain how blood glucose is controlled in the body after eating a meal. So for this question, you need to think about what eating a meal does. It raises blood sugar, and how that therefore means we need to get blood sugar back to its normal level using the principle of homeostasis. So I would personally first identify the pancreas as the organ detecting the change and mention the release of insulin to make it clear we know that's the hormone acting on the blood sugar concentration, and then explain what insulin does, and if you can, put it into the principle of negative feedback. So here's an example answer. So after a meal, blood glucose level rise. The pancreas detects this and releases insulin. Insulin causes cells to absorb glucose and the liver to store glucose as glucagon, and this lowers blood glucose back to normal. You can't see that one here because I think I'm in the way, but the question is name the organ that releases insulin. So here, I know we've just seen it on the last question, but what you would do if you haven't seen the question before is recall the organ based on the information provided. So what does insulin do and what organ is involved with this? And obviously we know the answer is pancreas, as we've just discussed, but this could come up with many different types of organs. So always try and think of the information and think about what is being described, what does that do, and how do I understand that overall picture of that particular function in the body, and that can help recall what organ's responsible for that. So question 3 is describe the role of a reflex action and why it is important. So that's 2 marks. So 1 mark for the role and 1 mark for the importance. So give a clear definition and then emphasize speed and purpose, I would usually say. I know that's technically 2 points, but it will help actually provide a coherent answer. So for example, a reflex is a rapid automatic response, 1 mark, to a stimulus. It happens without conscious thought, so is quick to protect the body from harm. And that is just the 2 points there, without conscious thought and protect the body from harm, making it speed and purposeful. So question 4, give 2 factors that might affect a person's reaction time. So this will be linked to your required practical. It will be something that you've already experienced and discussed in class as well. So here it's about giving 2 scientifically valid specific factors. So avoid vague answers in this case, such as lifestyle of what. We don't know whether it's going to be a particular thing will be a positive or negative on a reaction time. So examples here might be age, use of drugs, tiredness or lack of sleep, and sex and gender as well would also be a valid answer in this case. And question 5, give 1 advantage and 1 disadvantage of taking oral contraceptives to prevent pregnancy. So here we are just given an advantage and disadvantage, so you don't need to evaluate any points you make, just recalling some, just those AO1 points, you're just recalling some advantages and disadvantages that you're already aware of. And often in this scenario, you'll be given a bit more context for a particular person as well, which can help make sure that you apply an appropriate advantage and disadvantage, because those aren't the same for every individual. So we're identifying 1 benefit, focusing potentially on effectiveness, that's quite a common one to use, and identify 1 limitation. So for any contraceptive that you're asked to give a disadvantage of, what are those health risks and what doesn't it prevent, because that's often a good disadvantage to use. So here I could say something like it's highly effective at preventing pregnancy, or could even say 99% effective, but highly effective is usually the key word that is on the mark schemes. And a disadvantage doesn't protect against sexually transmitted infections. That's a common one used for the oral contraceptives. And on these kind of questions, I would just make it as clear as possible. So really highlighting advantage, this is my advantage, and disadvantage, just so everything is as clear to the examiner as you can possibly make it. So example question 6, a stimulus from a hot pan will cause the muscles in the arm to contract and move the finger away. Describe how the stimulus from the hot pan reaches the muscle in the arm. So this 5-mark question is also about reflex arcs. However, rather than the question we saw on the previous page, which asked us to describe what a reflex arc is, this one is asking us to describe how it happens. So we might want to be naming the structures involved and outlining the sequence of communication in the reflex arc. So an example answer, and these ones are slightly longer, might be the stimulus is detected by the receptor, 1 mark, which initiates an electrical impulse. And electrical is the key point for that mark there. The impulse travels via the neurons, 1 mark. Firstly the sensory, then relay, then motor neurons, 1 mark. Crossing the synapses between neurons, 1 mark. Synapse, that was for synapses, as a chemical signal. So chemical signal's the key point there, until it reaches the effector muscles in the arms. So that's outlining those sequences from stimulus to muscles in the arm. So explain why the endocrine system is important for maintaining optimal conditions in the body. So here we want to be mentioning hormones because the endocrine system is related to hormones, and explaining the role in internal regulation because we're talking about conditions in the body, and then linking to homeostasis as well because we haven't had homeostasis mentioned in the question. Therefore, it should be obvious to us that the examiner wants us to make that connection. So for example, the endocrine system is an example of homeostatic control system because it releases hormones to regulate bodily functions in response to changes in internal conditions. So we've talked about hormones, we've talked about internal conditions and homeostatic control. So that question would be worth 3 marks. So example question 8 is outline the relationship between obesity and type 2 diabetes and how lifestyle changes can reduce the risk. So we're talking about type 2 diabetes here, so we know that we're talking about insulin resistance rather than the inability to produce insulin, which is type 1 diabetes. And we need to mention diabetes and suggest some specific lifestyle changes and why they will help. So firstly, outlining that relationship, obesity is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. So risk factor is important there because excess body fat can lead to insulin resistance. So we're explaining how that link is made. And then a balanced diet contributes to reducing risk as well as exercise. And balanced diet and regular exercise there would, in this scenario, be 1 mark each, giving us a 4-mark answer. So question 9, this will be the final one for B5. State the waste substance that will be present in the patient's urine at the highest concentration. So that's quite a vague one here, but in fact this question would come with a table. So this table shows us the concentration of blood entering the kidney and the concentration of blood leaving the kidney. So combined students, this question wouldn't come up for you, but it's quite good to just get familiar with reading tables and being able to extract the information you need from those tables. So we can see here, we've got different concentrations entering and different concentrations leaving. And so now the question is asking us about the patient's, what will be highest in the concentration of the patient's urine. So urine is made in the kidneys, therefore if there's less leaving the kidney in the blood, that means it's gone into the urine. So which of these numbers has decreased the most is basically what the question's asking. So look at the concentration differences before and after, and we should find that urea shows the biggest drop. Therefore it's most filtered into the urine. So the answer here is urea. So now it's your turn. You can either complete the revision clocks we provided below for B5 or have a go at the range of B5 questions we've also linked on Revision Hub. So have a go now and then we can come back to this video when you're ready to cover B6. So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those questions with the revision clocks. We're now going to go over B6. So let's start with going through the key concepts for each part of this topic. So we start with sexual versus asexual reproduction, and that includes the processes of each of them in animals and plants, and also meiosis as well. And then for triple science students, you need to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction. And then everybody also needs to be able to understand the structure of DNA and the concept of genetic material. And this also links to understanding the human genome and the importance of the developments in that field. For triple science students, you also need to be able to describe the structure of DNA, which includes the double helix and the idea of base pairs. And then if you're doing the higher tier paper, you also need to understand the simple processes and steps in protein synthesis, the concept of complementary strands, mutations, and also the existence of non-coding DNA. Everybody also needs to understand genetic inheritance, so this includes the existence of alleles and how the key terms dominant and recessive alleles contribute to our understanding of genetics. You also need to be able to create Punnett squares and use those to calculate the probability of certain traits, or certain genotypes rather, and phenotypes being present given some parent genotypes, family trees, and also be able to determine the Punnett square and the way we can figure out sex determination probabilities. And then finally, you also need to have an awareness of some examples of inherited disorders such as cystic fibrosis, which is a recessive trait, polydactyly, which is caused by a dominant allele, and also genetic screening, what the process of genetic screening is, and have some evaluative points ready, considering the societal, ethical, potentially political impact of that as well. And again, just to recap the key concepts in B6 Part 2, we have variation, evolution, speciation, selective breeding, genetic engineering steps for higher tier students, cloning, so tissue culture, embryo culture, and adult cell cloning for triple students, the development of the theory of evolution, speciation, and that understanding of genetics. Again, that's a triple tier student topic. The evidence for evolution, and that's for everybody, so fossils, extinction, and resistant bacteria. And then finally, classification systems and how we can interpret evolutionary trees. And evolutionary trees is a little old favourite of examiners as well, so always watch out for those. So let's go through a few examples of B6 questions. So question 1, 2 parents are carriers for cystic fibrosis. Use a genetic diagram to predict the chance of their child having the condition. And I'm going to get this all up here to try and help explain how you'd approach this question. So we've been told that 2 parents are carriers for cystic fibrosis. This means that they have the gene, but that it is not present in their phenotypes. And because we know that cystic fibrosis is a recessive gene, therefore anyone who has cystic fibrosis will have to have 2 forms of the recessive gene and not have the dominant gene, otherwise they wouldn't express the phenotype. We know that the parents are both heterozygous for the cystic fibrosis gene, therefore we would write that as a capital F and a little f. So for this question, we need to put this into a Punnett square. Often in the exam, they might provide you with a Punnett square to fill in. That's always a really good clue as to how to approach a question. So we'd put each of the alleles rather, into each of the squares on the outside, and then just read off the table of the square how all of these need to be fitted in. And then we just need to calculate the correct probability of their offspring having the condition, so having the homozygous recessive genotype, so that little f there, and that's 1 out of the 4 scenarios here. Therefore, we can determine that to be 25%, and going through that process will get you 4 marks for that question. Example question 2 is common water fleas reproduce asexually. Each body cell of a parent contains 24 chromosomes, so how many chromosomes will each body cell of the offspring have? And now this is probably put as a question to be not a trick, but rather to catch students out and make sure that they're not second guessing their knowledge. So we know that asexual reproduction produces genetically identical offspring, therefore the chromosome number stays the same, which makes the answer 24, but a common mistake on this question, according to the examiner report, is to say 12 or 48. Some people think that there has to be a change, otherwise we wouldn't have the question asked, but no, it's just asking for your understanding that asexual reproduction produces those genetically identical offspring, therefore they must have the same number of chromosomes as their parents. And so question 3 here, and apologies, I don't think you can see this fully, but the question is that 2 heterozygous fruit flies are crossed. The phenotypes of the offspring are as follows: 909 long-winged, 303 short-winged. So how many of these are likely to be heterozygous? So on this question, the examiner wants you to notice what those numbers mean, that 909 and 303. That gives that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. That is what we understand heterozygous crosses to produce, particularly for these kind of monohybrid crosses. So for this question, we know that of these ones here, there will be some homozygous dominant and heterozygous genotypes. If we were to apply it to a Punnett square, we would be expecting 1 homozygous dominant genotype, 2 heterozygous, and 1 homorecessive, which means that 50% of them will be heterozygous. Therefore, all we need to do really is just figure out the total number of offspring here and divide it by 2, because we're expecting 50% of them to be heterozygous. Therefore, the answer is 606. And so here's a few more example questions. So example question 4 is describe how a new advantageous mutation could spread through a population over time. So here we're explaining the significance of a new phenotype or advantage that is linked to survival and thus reproduction. So species getting to that reproductive age. Then the inheritance of that trait, which leads to the frequency in the population increasing. So explaining the significance after that trait becomes established within a population. So here's an example answer. A mutation creates a new trait that gives an advantage. Individuals with this trait are more likely to survive and reproduce. Their offspring inherit the mutation. Over generations, the mutation becomes more common in the population. And this is very common with describe questions. Often you're really aiming for 1 mark per sentence, 1 mark per description. So as long as you're confident that you're covering the points from A to B, you can be fairly confident that what you write will get you those marks. Even if you don't think you're writing very much, you don't need to explain everything for a describe question. So 4 sentences, 4 marks. And finally, this is the final question we'll go through for this B6 topic before I let you roam free on your own questions. So MRSA is a bacterium that has evolved to become resistant to antibiotics. This is another examiner favourite. With reference to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, explain how MRSA bacteria have evolved to become resistant to antibiotics. And as you can see, this is a 6-mark question, so we want to be explaining ourselves and providing a coherent response. So here it is a longer answer, but it's important not to waffle and stick closely to the question by explaining how mutations lead to the variation and how antibiotics act as a selective pressure. And this means that the resistant bacteria survive, reproduce, and pass on the gene, and how this becomes more established in the population. So it's very similar to the last question about mutations, but here we're applying it to an example and we're talking about it in a specific context. So we're talking about a specific selection pressure. So let's go through an example answer here. In a population of MRSA bacteria, random genetic mutations can occur during reproduction. Some of these mutations may result in a resistance to antibiotics. When antibiotics are used, they act as a selection pressure. The bacteria without resistance are killed, while those with resistant genes survive. These resistant bacteria then reproduce, passing on the beneficial mutation to their offspring. Over many generations, the proportion of bacteria in the population with resistance increases. This is because they're better adapted to survive in environments where antibiotics are present. This process is an example of natural selection, as only the individuals with advantageous traits survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes. So it is very similar to the question before, but it's in a lot more detail, and it's important that you don't mix up the two. So do not write an answer like this for the answer above. It's way too detailed and is a waste of time. However, it's important to identify those kind of questions where it is more or less important to give that level of detail. And obviously you can determine that from the number of marks allotted to a question, but also whether it gives you a context that you need to add information in about. So in this case, it's MRSA. So now it's your turn to either complete the revision clocks for B6 if you want a bit more time covering the content and just putting out all the information you know about a topic at the moment, and then maybe going away a little bit to refresh your memory on some of the key subtopics, or have a go at our range of the B6 questions on the revision hub below, and then you can come back to this video when you are ready to go over the final topic of ecology. Okay, so let's go through the key concepts for ecology. So you need to know the definitions of species, population, community, and ecosystems, and the idea of interdependent and stable communities. Abiotic and biotic factors affecting distribution is also a very common exam question, as is structural, behavioural and functional adaptations to different environments and different species. And then also there might often be cases of extremophiles come up. We've gone through some in the core content, but there might be new scenarios that come up as well. You also need to understand feeding relationships and how to measure the abundance of organisms, which is related to the required practical field investigations, as well as understanding the water and carbon cycles. And then for triple science students, you need to know the process of decay and how it links to composting. And then also triple and higher tier students need to understand the impact of environmental change on some of the processes above, as well as different contexts and scenarios that will come up, such as the ones in the second part of B7 Ecology. And this includes biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity and the threats to biodiversity, how we manage waste, the human impact on the environment of our activities, so pollution, land use, deforestation and global warming are all key things we need to be able to discuss and evaluate, how we can maintain biodiversity through conservation and biodiversity programs, and then triple science students need to be able to talk about trophic levels. So these are the pyramid of biomass and transfer of biomass. We have an example of one of those coming up. Factors affecting food security, farming techniques, sustainable fisheries, and the use of biotechnology. And those final ones there are all only for triple science students. If you're combined, don't worry, you don't need to cover those. So let's go through a few examples of some B7 questions. So question 1, which is a 3-mark answer, is explain how a community can be affected by the removal of one species. So here, removal of one species, we need to think about what keyword from the specification is most strongly linked to this. And in this case, it is the idea of interdependence, because interdependence is the way that species rely on each other to produce stable communities. So here we want to mention interdependence and give 2 consequences, because it's a 3-mark question that logically following that removal of a species. So here's an example answer. Communities are interdependent. Removing one species can affect food chains. For example, predators may decline if prey is removed, or prey may increase if predators are removed. It may also lead to increased competition for remaining resources like food or shelter. Now this question is longer than it needs to be. This answer rather is longer than it needs to be. You don't need to do the vice versa bit in the middle, and you could make it a bit more concise to save time, but it is a strong answer and it does fully explain the question. So question 2 is describe how a quadrat can be used to obtain quantitative data. So this is directly linked to your required practical. So here you want to be outlining the steps. So for example, place a quadrat randomly in a chosen area using a method like a random number generator. So we've gone through the first bit of our method and we've mentioned it has to be random, so we're linking it to sampling there. Count the number of target organisms within the quadrat or estimate the percentage cover. You don't have to talk about both of them. I just wanted to make sure that we're recalling all of the key points here. And repeat in several locations to obtain reliable data. So we've really kind of gone over those key points. We've talked about the method and we've also talked about how we're making sure that everything is sampled in an appropriate way. And that's only a 3-mark answer, so it doesn't need to be in a lot of detail. If it was a 6-mark answer, you might want to be discussing the independent and dependent control variables and some of the equipment in a bit more detail, and potentially a bit more information about that data collection. Example question 3 is give 2 biological consequences of global warming. So here we want 2, again, specific and valid biological effects. So we want biological effects rather than societal or environmental. So here we want to be focusing on habitats, biodiversity, and potentially disease spread as well. So an example answer here, it would be quite a good one to put into bullet points just so you know you're making 2 points. So it could be the loss of habitats such as melting polar ice or the increased spread of diseases, and I've put there due to warmer climates. So example question 4 is evaluate. So this is an AO3 question. The challenges of using global consensus to address climate change. And so here we're really discussing why cooperation is needed and why it's done, and then give reasons for why it's difficult. So that could be economic, political, and fairness reasons as well, which are sometimes ethical reasons. So we're talking about the need for it, but then given some of the issues that arise for those evaluative points. And again, I'm very sorry I haven't covered that very well, but I will read it all out so you get a good idea of the answer. So here I have put that climate change requires global cooperation, but countries have different priorities and resources. Some nations may not want to reduce emissions due to economic impacts. Developing countries are often more affected but contributed less, and disagreements about responsibility and funding make consensus difficult. So we are talking about, in every sentence, an evaluative point which makes it challenging for a global consensus to be reached. Question 5 is explain why cycling resources rather than dumping waste in landfill helps maintain diversity. So for this question, we are really trying to compare recycling to dumping waste in landfill and relate that to biodiversity. So here's an example answer, that recycling reduces the need to extract raw materials, which helps preserve habitats. So we've compared recycling to dumping waste because we've said that we don't need new materials for recycling, and then spoke about preserving habitats, which is directly linked to biodiversity. It also lowers pollution and reduces habitat loss caused by creating new landfill sites. So although we're talking about reducing habitat loss or preserving habitats in both, we're coming from it from a different angle, which gives it 2 reasons relating to recycling compared to landfill. And then finally, a final question we've got to cover with B7 is calculating the percentage of energy in the primary consumer that was transferred into the energy of the tertiary consumer in this diagram here, and give your answer to 2 decimal points. So this is a triple science only topic, but again, I think for combined students it's really important just to have that recap of how we're extracting information from a figure to produce our answer. So the question is asking us to relate the primary consumer, there's the primary consumer in our figure, to the tertiary consumer here. So we're looking for the percentage difference between the two. Therefore, it's a case of inputting the percentage calculation, which we've done not just in biology, but in lots of different other subjects as well. And that gives us a percentage of 0.48%. So now, again, it's your turn to either complete the revision clocks for B7 or have a go at our range of questions on the revision hub. At the end of this video, we're just going to close slightly with a few extra tips and tricks for approaching paper 2. So come back once you are finished with those, or stick around now and we'll head straight on into it. So I just wanted to go through a few final tips for approaching your exam. So whenever you see a question in an exam, unless you are extremely confident with it, I would recommend reading the command word time and time again. What does this question want me to do? And then underlying key data or ideas that you see within the question to help you determine how you should be approaching this from a topic perspective. I would recommend you plan your longer answers before writing them, even if this is just a few bullet points just to clear your mind and produce a sequential response. It can save time in the long run, but equally, as I say that, it's important to not spend too much time on it, because otherwise you will lose time for extra parts of the paper. Attempt every question, even if you don't feel like you know the answer at all. You never know. Just writing something which is vaguely related to the topic at hand can be enough to get you marks, because examiners have a set number of key terms or phrases that they're looking for within the mark scheme, and often even just writing one of them will be enough to get you an extra mark or two there where you may not be expecting to, and you may not want to if you don't feel confident writing a full answer. So always attempt it. You want to be making sure those 6 mark answers are structured with clear points so examiners can easily identify the mark-worthy parts of your answer. And finally, if you are doing figures or calculations, you want to be labelling everything very clearly. And then in calculations, you want to be showing your steps very clearly and providing the units if they haven't already been provided. So just taking that time to do those things which have been drilled into you in lessons, being neat and clear, is just as important in exams as it is in your work booklet. So that's everything from me today, and thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on the paper 2 topics with me and go through some examples. If you haven't done the revision clocks or the practice questions yet, I'd highly recommend you do so before the exam. But in the meantime, all the best with your revision going forward, and hopefully I'll see you on the chemistry or physics paper 2 topics. But if not, all the best, and show off and try and enjoy